Hey everyone, this is Erica Lucas, your host and founding member of VEST, an organization connecting women across industries, regions, and career levels, so that together we can expedite the pipeline of more women in positions of power and influence. Welcome to another episode of the Vester podcast, where we explore the invisible barriers holding women back in the workplace and share stories of women building power collectively.
American culture is based on the assumptive nature of heterosexuality and of cisgenderness. We see those things as being other or special, not recognizing that we have been around forever and we are in every aspect of society. We have just taken that out of the equation. If you look at how we look at history, it is focused on the white experience. It's focused on a male experience. We don't ever really consider, there must not have been gay people around back then. Well, there were tons of gay people around back then. There were tons of trans people around back then. There are, accounts of trans people in World War II and how they fought on the front lines. Eleanor Roosevelt was bisexual, but nobody talks about that. Jane Addams, who is like the mother of social work, was in a relationship with another woman and hid it for her whole lifetime because she was afraid of what people would think about her. We have always been in places, but what we have done is hide because it has been dangerous.
In this episode, we discuss common misconceptions and stereotypes around the LGBTQ community with licensed clinical social worker, sex therapist, and the founder and CEO of Inclusive Insight Psychotherapy, Laura Grimes. We also cover ways to identify our own cultural blind spots so that together we can build more intentional and inclusive workspaces. This episode is sponsored by Audible, the leading provider of audiobooks, podcasts, guided wellness programs, and more. So if you're looking for a book on how to level up at work or any other subject, Audible has over 1,000 titles for you to choose from. Head over to www.audibletrial.com/vesther and get a 30-day free trial plus a free credit to use on the book of your choice. To access our guest's full bio and for show notes, go to www.vesther.co/podcast. This recording was part of a more intimate coaching session with VEST members and has been repurposed to accommodate this episode. Laura, what are some of the most common misconceptions and stereotypes about the LGBTQ+ community that we must challenge and dismantle?
Well, the primary one would be that we are one community. I think really when we talk about the LGBTQIA+, basically we're talking about all the letters except H, which is ridiculous because heterosexual people also have a sexual orientation, and most of us don't get taught about it or about how that impacts us, right? And so the primary misconception is that all of those letters have a lot in common, and they don't. They are very different groups of people. Sometimes people, identify with one or more letters in that group, but it is very, very broad. And basically, it is a bunch of letters that means that these are communities and people that we don't really understand and we think that are somehow very different and othered. So it's very much an other category, right? Rather than recognizing that we are everywhere. There is not one community and we exist everywhere, but the assumption of heterosexuality and of being cisgender, of identifying the same way that you were assigned at birth, is something that is kind of prevalent in our society. We think of heterosexuality as being normative and anything else as being abnormal, rather than recognizing that our sexuality is on a spectrum. We don't ever get taught these things. Nobody told me when I was little that I might want to grow up and marry a girl. Nobody told me that there was an option for how I might identify and that there were different ways to identify. And so this assumptive process in our identity just moves forward and snowballs into every aspect of society. And so this idea that there are very few of us, or that we are less than 10% of the population, any of these things that we kind of think are just not true. We exist in every part of every culture, and it just isn't something that is seen, because we are very heteronormative in how we do things.
How can we identify our own cultural blind spots and isms
Mhm.
when it comes to this specific subject?
I think one of the things is to think about the things that you don't see, or that you haven't paid attention to, and to be curious about that. Most of the time, we are fearful because we are afraid of making a mistake, right? People are afraid of saying something wrong and of offense, rather than trying to approach something out of curiosity. Culturally, though, we do not look at identity and sexuality as something that we should approach with curiosity, because we've been taught that it's something that we should be ashamed of, that somehow it's aberrant, or that it's bad. There's a lot of messages in our religions that tell us that there is something wrong with people that are not straight or not cis. And yet we never really challenge ourselves to ask ourselves why that is, and whether or not it's actually true. And so being able to be curious about those things, and to really think about why we learned the things that we did, what were the reasons that it was there. Most of the time, what research shows actually is that if somebody meets somebody who is of a different culture and gets to know them, all of a sudden, all of those misconceptions go away. Right? They're like, oh, well, you're not like that. And basically what we mean is, oh, I got to know you, and no longer do I see you as a gay person or a Black person. I see you as a person, and you are multifaceted in your identities, and there's not just one way to see you, right? But in LGBT communities, because we are continually othered, and it's very invisible in how it happens, because of our assumptions around heteronormativity and around cisgenderness, that we don't even see the places where we are being missed. And then it's up to the people who are engaged in those groups, who identify in that way, to out themselves, rather than to assume that they are already in the conversation. Because what happens for me is, I used to do a lot of trainings at hospitals around Chicago, and there's a lot of Catholic hospitals in Chicago. And there was a couple of different times that I went to Catholic hospitals, and I was training nuns who were nurses on gender and sexuality. And so I would do my 101 spiel about gender and sexuality, and how to understand these different concepts. And every time I did it, afterwards, a nun would come up to me, and they would whisper in my ear, and they would say, I identify as male, but I've never told anybody. And what I did about it was, I became a nun, because that was my only option. And then I just didn't have to think about it anymore. And so I always know that people are in the room. They have just never said that they are in the room, because they don't know if it's safe to. And so part of what we do is we recognize that everyone is everywhere. We are continually in the room with people, and we don't necessarily know how they identify. And we should ask, right? We should not assume that they are straight, that they are married to a man if they are a woman, that how they look is, if they look female, that must mean that they identify as female. If they look masculine, they must identify as masculine. We try and take away those assumptions and become more inclusive. Probably the primary thing that makes that really hard, though, is our language, because our language is very gendered.
That was actually going to be my next question. How does language and terminology impact the inclusion, and and how do we make it more intentionally inclusive
Right.
if we're always abiding by those things?
We are. So the difficulty is, like, of course we want female spaces, right? We are a marginalized group. We want female spaces. But for someone who is not assigned female at birth, but still identifies as female, the first thing they're going to do is figure out whether or not those female spaces actually include them, right? Is it going to be safe for them, or is it going to be a place where somebody says, well, you aren't really a woman. You don't really belong here because you don't fit our idea of being a woman, right? It's very hard because our culture is a binary. We look at boys and girls, straight or gay. Everything is sort of in opposition, rather than looking at masculine and feminine, right? Masculinity and femininity exist in tandem together. They aren't in opposition. You have masculine qualities, and those don't take away from your feminine qualities, right? But we used to look at it as they were opposite. In order to be more feminine, you had to be less masculine, right? And we allow a lot more leeway for female-born, female socialized individuals. There's more leeway. We can wear jeans and no one questions our femininity, right? But if a person assigned male at birth who is walking through the world looking male wears a dress to the office, there's a problem, right? Because we have less room for that variedness in masculinity. There is a way that someone is supposed to be masculine and present that in a particular way. And so what this does is this sets up spaces where people are continually trying to figure out if they're going to be read as being okay to be there, right? My daughters are biracial. They are Black and white. And continually, my daughter will talk about the fact, she's in high school, and she will talk about the fact that she doesn't feel Black enough to be in Black spaces, but she also doesn't identify as straight. And so then she also then ends up feeling like she has to pick between these different identities because she doesn't know many people that identify the same way that she does, right? And so often what happens is that people are continually trying to figure out if they're okay in a space. Is it safe for them? And what we know is that this is not something that people make up, right? This is something that is very real in that we have laws that are being passed that are going to ultimately mean that some people, in order to get their own health care, it will be illegal for them to get it. And so it's not just a matter of it being like maybe people won't be nice. It is really, is my job in jeopardy? Is my housing in jeopardy? Are my kids in jeopardy? I love Oklahoma. I am actually from there. All of my family is from Oklahoma. So this felt very serendipitous to meet Erica because I love Oklahoma. I only lived there for a short amount of time, but once you live in Chicago, if you meet someone from Oklahoma, you feel like you know everyone there because it's such a different environment. But when my husband and I go back to Oklahoma to visit family, there are gas stations he doesn't go into. And the reason is because we are assessing whether or not it's safe for him, right? There are still places that we go that we can't get hotel rooms if they see that we are an interracial couple. And so the idea that somebody who is LGBT, identifies as is other in that way is also trying to navigate those spaces. They're really trying to figure out if it's a life or death situation.
I do have I'm just going to share this struggle because and I hate to bring the Latina subject every time, but hey, that is where I'm coming from. But I just don't know what can we do because it's hard enough to be a minority and just to walk into a place and you have to change your language and speak English so you don't make other feel uncomfortable, and so you don't want to like make any discomfort in anybody. But in addition to that, be from the LGBTQI and just you are a minority already, and then on top of that you add another and I seen the struggle with the second generation immigrants that yes, you have to adapt to the culture, your parents are not from here, and then you dive into a bilingual household, which is bicultural, and on top of that you are gay. It's
Yep.
like it's like another level, and I hate to put it, it's already difficult, but I just wanted to add to this conversation how extremely hard it is for our kids to fight for the rights when they already have a fight to, a battle to fight, which is being Latino.
Absolutely. The intersectionality of those things are something that's actually one of the hardest things about being in the LGBT communities, is that when we talk about the LGBT community, we are really talking about the white community. We are talking about the majority culture. This is true in every place that we talk about communities. We talk about majority culture first. And so what you're talking about is the intersectionality, right? Of how do we, if you own one marginalized identity, as in not being white, and you also identify as not being straight, and you are not cis, then those marginal identities compound. And it is even harder. And that invisibility often ends up meaning that people feel like they have to choose. They have to choose between being Latina and being gay, like which is which, right? And often that means that there is a real grief in not being able to find a community that celebrates all of who you are. And the LGBT community is not a safe space for everybody. We still deal with racism and sexism and all of the isms that majority cultures go through. We deal with those. And so, gay Hispanic people talk about this very thing. Black, queer people talk about this as well, is that this feeling like there has to be a choice between identities. And that really is very hard for people, because you're already talking about having to kind of cordon yourself off in these ways that you feel othered.
One thing that gives me hope, it's the new generation, Gen Zs. They're not going to put up with being put in a box, right? And I feel like by the way, I have 2 Gen Zs at home, and I love them to tears, and they challenge me each and every day. Which leads to my next question. What are some of the historical, because again, and my daughter, by the way, identifies as gay, as a Latina. And again, she challenged my thinking all the time. Even when I think I'm very progressive, she's still always, challenging my thinking, which I appreciate. What are some of the historical and cultural factors that have contributed to the marginalization of these? And how do we address those today, particularly as, these new generation is kind of putting it out there, whether you like it or not?
Right. The factor is that we have American culture is based on the assumptive nature of heterosexuality and of cisgenderness. We see those things as being other or special, not recognizing that we have been around forever and we are in every aspect of society. We have just taken that out of the equation. And because there isn't, we have kind of, we have whitewashed our history. We have degendered our history in many ways, right? We see, if you look at how we look at history, it is focused on the white experience. It's focused on a male experience. We don't ever really consider, there must not have been gay people around back then. Well, there were tons of gay people around back then. There were tons of trans people around back then, but it wasn't okay to talk about it. And there wasn't the media, now the ability to sort of know different communities in different ways. And so those things go away. It reminds me, for example, of, I was having a conversation one time with a client, an older straight white male client, and he made the comment that he had seen the movie Hidden Figures, and he didn't think that it was true. He didn't think it was based on a true story. And I said, oh, well, tell me more about that. And he said, well, if that had really gone on, if there had really been Black women doing that back then, they would have told us. And there was no one that ever told us that happened. And so that it can't be true, that must be something that was made up. And so then having to talk about how much we didn't talk about those things back then. We didn't give people credit when those people were people that were deemed less than the majority, which is less than white, straight, cis men, right? Because that is the culture that we are under. We are in a patriarchy and we assume whiteness in everything. And so people then think that we are not anywhere. And I think that's the biggest thing, is to be able to kind of blow people away, to say, well, actually, we have been everywhere. We have always been everywhere. And here are all the different places. There are, accounts of trans people in World War II and how they fought on the front lines. There have been gay people everywhere. Eleanor Roosevelt was bisexual, but nobody talks about that. Jane Addams, who is like the mother of social work, was in a relationship with another woman and hid it for her whole lifetime because she was afraid of what people would think about her. And so we have always been in places, but what we have done is hide because it has been dangerous. And now we are in a really pivotal moment in what's happening in our culture, where we are making laws that it's going to be necessary for people to hide. That in order to be able to get basic rights, to get basic care, they're going to have to hide who they are, which will then mean that there will be less ability for us to see that people are everywhere, right? There are so many gay LGBT people in Oklahoma, but they all call and they say something about how they can't find anyone in Oklahoma to talk to. And then they find out I'm from Oklahoma and they're like, oh my gosh, it's another person, and they all of a sudden they feel very seen, right? But for anyone, I'm sure that there are people in this, in this discussion now where you have had to decide whether or not you were going to tell people how you identify. And you were trying to decide if it meant that it was going to impact your ability to work or impact this relationship, or that it was going to end up outing you in a way that would be dangerous for you with your family. There's all these things that impact people's ability to really be vocal about who they are.
Anybody have any questions?
There are no dumb questions, by the way. This is not stuff that we typically talk about. So even if you feel like it's a weird question, it's okay.
I have a question.
Wait, Sheena, go ahead.
Hi, Sheena Pazzo. Nice to meet you. I'm sorry I had to mute through a little bit of that, so I hope I didn't miss an answer to this. But I do some work with a nonprofit that handles interpersonal violence. And one of the topics that we were talking about addressing is the violence committed against the LGBTQIA plus community. And I wonder if you have any thoughts or direction or insight on that.
About intimate partner violence or community violence in general?
Actually, both.
Okay. Intimate partner violence, the difficulty is that often in order to enter into any system, we have to enter into the dominant culture. So what that means for a lesbian who is trying to, leave a violent relationship is that she has to decide if the violence is bad enough that she needs to go to a shelter that is going to be discriminatory against her because she's not in a relationship with a man, right? And is it going to be okay for her? For gay men, it's a completely different animal, because then what happens is that there's very few assumptions or understanding about men being in violent relationships, and that there's not the ability. It's seen as mutual violence rather than a power dynamic that is there, that's always there regardless of gender. And in this conversation, every system that we enter into is a binary, which means that if you don't identify as a cis woman or a cis man, you are then having to evaluate if it's okay for you at all to be there. If you are identify as a woman, you have been living your life as female, but you were assigned male at birth, you have to figure out whether or not it is too dangerous for you to go into that environment, or will you be seen as a predator for being there? And so those systems that we all enter into are very much a binary and assume heteronormativity, right? And so if you put a lesbian in a domestic violence shelter with other women, then are the other women then feeling like maybe they are going to be preyed upon because there is a lesbian in their mix, right? Because we then have fears around that happening. In general, for societal violence, this is huge and massive in a way that would take a lot longer to talk about. For trans and non-binary individuals, for people who are not cisgender, the statistic is debated, but it's roughly that for anyone who identifies as trans and as non-cis, has a 50-50 shot at being a victim of homicide or suicide. So the statistics are really, really harrowing, and these things aren't overblown. When a trans woman is walking down the street, she is continually trying to figure out if she's going to be the victim of a hate crime. And that's not paranoia, that's reality. And so if you can think about how many people walk through the world wondering if they're going to be okay going to the grocery store, how that would impact a person's ability to live in the world and to feel like they had agency to make decisions and autonomy around what happens in their lives. And so there's so much fear around this violence. And while social media is great, and I think that the widening of the information that we have can be really helpful, it has also bred a lot of hatred and a lot of misconceptions. And so now what we have is we have people who are dealing with the extremes in our culture, where we have these extremes of, the right and the left, and these ways in which we don't feel like we can come together and have conversations about those issues.
Thank you, Laura. Kristen?
Hi. Thank you, Laura, for this conversation. I'm working on creating an entrepreneurship space, and it's important to me that, we create spaces and to this conversation that allow people to know that this is a safe space for everyone. And so one of the things that I've done with a couple of people specifically in the LGBTQ community is, one, connected them to, at least for me, being close to OU, knowing all of the great things that the Women and Equality Center is doing with students there and the programming that they host. I'm just curious, in regards to workplaces, what are some recommendations of things that we could be doing in our workspace so that it does promote that this is a safe space for various people? Like, I even have, a monarch butterfly sign that I got from OU that is a symbol for dreamers and for undocumented individuals. And, at a lot of universities, you can get various ally stickers for doors and areas. I would just love to know some of your thoughts on that when it comes to maybe things to do, ways to promote, events to have, whatever that might look like.
Yeah, those things are really, really important, because the first thing that any person who is within LGBT communities does is we're scanning to figure out if it's safe for us. So we see a rainbow on something, we're like, oh, okay, I think I'm okay here. It's kind of like the butterfly, right? There's ways in which you can put up information where you can promote inclusivity that is really, really important. And those are small things that you can do, right? Because for people where they're not yet out, where they're not sure it's safe, they're going to see those things and they're going to know that you're an ally and that you are okay. The main thing that we can do is change our systems and our forms and the way that people enter into spaces to recognize that they are inclusive, right? That they that you are seeing people that may not necessarily know that it's okay to be there. So my intake paperwork, like our intake paperwork, right, is that we have a space for somebody's legal name, and then we have a space for their preferred name. We ask a person's pronouns. We ask a person's sexual orientation, their gender identity. We find out how they identify, and then we identify them respectfully in those ways. The primary way that you do that is that you de-gender the language that you already use. And this is one of the hardest things that we do. So if you notice, for example, that there are some of us that have pronouns listed, when you list a pronoun behind your name, when you put it in your email, when you put it in your email signature, if you put it on forms, what you're doing is that you're saying to someone, I am aware that pronouns matter and that the way that you see me may not fit my pronoun. And so I'm letting you know that. You are also then letting the person know that they can share theirs. And rather than asking people, what I do is that I introduce myself first. And I will say, hi, my name is Laura. I use she, her pronouns. I don't necessarily ask another person to do that because I don't want to put them on the spot. But normally when you do that, someone follows suit. They're like, oh, my name is Erica. I use she, her pronouns, and they will go ahead and offer that information. The other thing that we do is that we don't use language this is very typical for Oklahoma and in Southern spaces where you use ma'am and sir, Mr. and Mrs. You actually need to strike that from the language that you use. And you need to take gender out of the equation, unless you know that someone wants it. Right. So, for example, if I am working with an older Black woman and I introduce myself and I know what their name is, I'm probably going to use Miss before her name. And the reason would be because that would be culturally appropriate for me addressing an older Black woman to do that. But I would ask first, is this how is this the name that you want to use? And I then don't assume that the way that I want to identify or the way that I see her is the way that she wants to be identified or the way that she sees herself. I've had clients who have sat in my office for years before they told me that they didn't identify the way that they were assigned at birth. And so you don't always know who you're talking to. But when you allow that person to have that option, when you allow them to give you that information, then what they do is they open up about it. Right. And so if you're asking a question of a student, for example, to say, so, are you dating anyone? Is there anyone in particular that's important in your life? I don't say, do you have a girlfriend? Or are you married? Or if I see, a person that I assign male as the way that they appear, I don't say, oh, so how's your wife? I don't assume that they are married to a woman in that. And so what you do is you change your language. When you change your language, people are very aware of the fact that you get it. They are very aware then that they can bring more of themselves into the conversation. And so our systems aren't really good at that, right? Any system, if you think about hospital systems, educational systems, they are all really, really built and created with this foundation of a binary and of heterosexuality, right? Our bathroom situation, like literally just offering bathrooms that people can use without having to prove what parts their body has, is an important thing. Because if you have to walk through the world continually finding a bathroom where you might not be harassed or arrested seems like an unusual thing, and yet is something that millions of people deal with every day.
Laura, what about an organization like ours, right? We both, at the organizations that we run, both at obviously BEST is very intentional about creating safe spaces for women, but we intend women in the most inclusive way, meaning, trans, we want trans women, but I don't necessarily, and tell me if I'm wrong, I don't necessarily, if you tell me that you're a woman, a trans woman, you're a woman to me. Like, I don't, is that, how do we stay true to we want to support women unapologetically, anyone that identifies as or non-binary, while being intentional inclusive? And we do use the pronouns on applications or referrals, but what else can we do and how can we be intentional about it?
In media stuff and on website stuff, what you have to do is that you have to explain what you mean by women. So you use an asterisk. You explain that, you might put women identified rather than just women, because I think that there are lots of spaces that would be inclusive of people, but we're wondering whether or not it's going to be dangerous for us to say that. And so you have to be more inclusive and give those little tells in the social media stuff that's put out there in websites, in language, to make sure that you include those things. The other thing is that you have to find where those people are, and they aren't necessarily in the dominant heteronormative culture. So you have to to think about those spaces where queer communities show up, where we look for inclusion, where there is more advertising that's done to us, for us. Sadly, one of the best markets that got this was alcohol. Alcohol knows that there is a lot of money in the gay community. And how do you know that? Is that every June they put out a rainbow. They slap a rainbow on a vodka bottle. They slap a rainbow on, like Bud Light's getting a lot of backlash for doing the cans with the rainbow stuff on them. But what they did was that they managed to say, see, we see you and you are okay with us. And what that does is that then markets a whole community that isn't sure. And so what you have to do is that you have to market within those spaces. You have to market within spaces that are inhabited mostly by LGBT people. And it's a lot like I get this a lot, like white friends of mine will say, like, well, I want to know Black people, like I want to be friends with them. How can I be friends with them? And I find that to be such an odd thing sometimes, because I think, well, you are just a person and you are nice, right? But it's a lot like, I don't know, like for somebody, if somebody were to approach, like if I as a white person was to approach a Hispanic woman and say, how can I be a better friend to a Hispanic woman? Probably I would get an eye roll. Right? I would get like, what are you talking about? But part of that is that because we have these separations and we think that people are so different and that we don't want to learn from one another, we're afraid to kind of cross that divide. And white people, like whiteness and maleness, patriarchy, starts from this place of not asking questions, of that we should tiptoe around those things rather than addressing it directly, that we have differences. How does your ethnicity impact also your gender, and how is that in society, rather than being polite and thinking that what we do is we don't talk about it at all. Like, we all know that we're minorities in some way. We all know that. And how many of us, if some, man said, so you think that like sexism is a big part of business, how many of us would be like, sit down and I will talk to you about it, right? Like, we would take the time to explain it. My dad, actually, when Hillary Clinton was running for president, my dad and I are sitting in front of the television. He only watches Fox News, so you can tell that there's probably a big difference between the two of us. And he goes, I don't think sexism is that big of a deal. And I looked over at him and I was like, did you just say that out loud? And he's like, I just don't think it's that big of a deal. He's like, I don't think sexism like impacts women the way that they say that it does. It's not that big of a deal. And I said, I can't believe that I've been your daughter this long. At this point, I was in my 50s. And you have said this out loud. And I said, let me talk to you about sexism. And so I said, it started when I was 11. And I went through all of the things that had happened from the time that I started becoming a young person and moving through. And at the end, he was like, I didn't know those things happened to you. And I said, I know, because they didn't happen to you. and you didn't think that they were important. You just thought that that's how it was, but that's not how it is. That's how it is for you because you are a man. But for me, it is very different. I walk into the room and I have to figure out, like, what's dangerous for me? Am I going to be taken seriously? The primary place, actually, I talk about this. This is the first example I give everybody, is that I will ask men, I will say, what's the first thing you do when you go to your car? What's the first thing that you do when you go to your car? And the guy's like, well, I mean, I unlock it and I get in. And I'm like, that's not the first thing that I do. What's the first thing that you do when you get into a car? All of you can answer this question, right? The first thing you do is you look in the back to see if there's anyone that's going to be there to attack you. That's the first thing you do. You are checking to see if there's anyone behind you. You are checking to see if they're in the back seat. You have your keys in a particular way because you've been told that you need to hold your keys in a particular way in order to be safe. Every female-born person knows that this is what they do. But men, they just get into their cars, right? And so this huge difference is the way in which we don't see these things. So you think about LGBT people and you think, I wonder what it is like. Like, if you are straight and you are married to a person who is the opposite gender of you, think about for a week switching everything you say to be about a woman rather than a man. Everything that you talk about, your wife, your life with your wife, all of these things, it would be so awkward. And you would be thinking, I wonder what this person thinks about me, right? I have just said this thing. It feels so personal, which is what we do to LGBT people. We say, well, when you talk about your lives, it's too personal. Why do you have to make it about sex? Well, every orientation ends up being told that we're making it about sex, except heterosexuality, right? And yet heterosexuality is just inundated. We are inundated with it. My 4-year-old, for example, when my oldest daughter was about 3 or 4, she was playing with her Barbies one day, and she had 2 Barbies and a Ken. And I said something about, she said that they were getting married. And I said, oh, is Barbie getting married to Barbie, or is Barbie marrying Ken? And she goes, oh, no, mommy, Barbie is marrying Ken. And I said, why? And she goes, well, everybody knows there's only one princess in a castle. And I thought, oh my God, my 4-year-old just schooled me on heteronormativity, right? There's only one princess allowed in the castle. We start early on, but we don't really talk about those things. My mom always rolls her eyes when she would be like, when you grow up and you find a husband, and I would be walking through the house and I would say, or a wife, and she would roll her eyes and be like, that's ridiculous. And I'm like, it's not actually. She could grow up and marry a woman. You do not know yet, right? But we see that as somehow trying to like brainwash kids rather than allow them to understand that we do not know how they identify and they have options in understanding themselves.
We have VEST members that are, I would say 95% are in Oklahoma, but we do have other small pockets in Arkansas and Texas and even DC. But I would argue that most of the states where we have representations are creating very hostile environments. There's a lot of people that no longer feel safe here. You have a room full of women operators, women professionals, entrepreneurs, people that are creating safe spaces for others. What is our call to action besides, creating those spaces within our own system? How do we create systemic change? What is the call to action there?
The call to action would be that you actually have to talk to people that you don't want to talk to about these things and normalize the conversation for them. So what that means for me is that I have a real soft spot with working with conservative Christian people. The reason is because that's my family. That's my upbringing. When I came out, I was told I was going to hell, and that there was not really any hope for me unless I repented. And what I chose to do was to not exercise myself from my family relationships, but to continue to try and bring into conversation how these things impacted me and what was different. And so the first thing that you can do is talk to people that you don't talk to about these things. You just bring it up in conversation. You also need to put energy into looking at your representatives. We can't be, and lots of people are in this, we can't be one issue voters in ways that we can just say, this is what I'm going to do. We have to be very discriminating about looking at that and about looking at how this needs to shift. Oklahoma is going to only change if there's representatives there that will speak to that change. Mm-hmm. And so we have to politically put our energy into that. The other things that I think about, and this is new for me as a business owner, I'm an incredibly reluctant business owner. But the thing that I think about and what I find very odd is one of the hardest things that I have had to do is find marketing people for me. I think that that's a very strange thing because it seems like there's website developers and marketers everywhere. But one of the things I've said over and over is I do not want to hire 3 white, straight, cis dudes who know how to do IT to do my marketing, because I want to put my money where my mouth is. I want to hire a queer person of color. And clearly they exist and they are somewhere, but how do I find the marketers that are queer people of color? Where can I find them? And then committing to hiring those people. And what that has meant is that I have hired someone that's incredibly young and that we are very different in how we would approach things, but she is a queer person of color and she's the person that I'm hiring to do my marketing. I had a bunch of white straight dudes that are very proven in their field and could do it, but I was like, I can't do that. I can't put my money towards that and then say, this is what I want to do, is I want to be more inclusive. And so what that's meant is that I have had to look at hiring differently. I have had to look at how I look at people and commodities and benefits that they have, skills that they have differently. So one of the things that's different about IIPC, for example, is that we are very female-driven career path and focus, and yet it is very hard for single parents to be able to do this work because they can't get involved in it and stay in it because they have too many things that are impacting them being single parents. And so what I've done is I've hired women knowing that they're going to need more help with childcare. They're going to need more ability to be flexible with their time and flexible with how they take clients. And I'm going to need to pay them differently because their lives are different. One of my staff, for example, I found out is that one of the reasons why he couldn't take clients at night was because it was too dangerous for him to get home on the west side of Chicago after dark. And so I had to think about how he was going to get clients differently because of where he lived. Whereas being a privileged person on the north side of Chicago, I don't have to worry about what time I get home. It's very different for me. And so we have to look at it differently. And that means not just looking at it from the outside, but really engaging in people's lives in a way that we really commit to understanding what it's like for them.
There is one question that I think is very interesting that was dropped in the chat. And I'm sorry, we're not going to get to everyone's questions, but one is what can you give me tips for what I can do if I use the wrong pronouns?
Yeah. Say, oh, I'm sorry, and then change it.
Yeah.
The difficulty that people have with pronouns, I think, is that they try and think about changing their language rather than changing their experience of a person, right? If I look at you and I determine that based on what I see is how you identify, I am not really engaging in your experience. I'm engaging in my own. So if Risa, if I can use you for an example, you're in the top corner here. I am going to assume based on how Risa looks that Risa identifies as female. Right? She has long hair. She is more typically feminine in how she looks. And so if I do that, but I don't ask Risa how they actually identify, and I first then say, well, she looks this way, I have then put it on the onus of Risa to have to then correct me, rather than saying, hi, my name's Laura, your name's Risa, and Risa can say yes. And then I can say, oh, do you use she, her pronouns, or do you use different, like what are the pronouns that you prefer? And then I allow Risa to identify themselves. And what I have done is that I have altered the way that I have changed my language, right? And I haven't assumed something in it. Pronouns are like water. Or oxygen. We just assume them rather than like being able to take in that somebody identifies the way that they identify, and they don't need to look a particular way to identify that way. Everyone here has had people make mistakes, right? And if somebody acknowledges it and says, oh, I'm sorry, and I'll change that, we move on. It's the people that get defensive about that we tend to have problems with, right? And so what I would say is, you don't need to be defensive about mistakes, because we all make them. Right? We all make them. We assume things about things that we see. It's very hard for us to change that. And yet what we do is, if we change it in small ways, then it snowballs. We keep going.
If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend, and don't forget to leave us a review. And if you're ready to take your career to the next level, apply to join our community of professional women, all eager to help you get there and stay there. Go to www.besther.co and apply today.